Hello, everyone. I'm Augie Napoli, President and CEO of the United Way of Greater Cleveland.
I'm Danielle Sitnor, President of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP. Together, we are honored to present to the community this series of community conversations on the Cleveland Consent Decree. Each session will focus on an area of the consent decree and police reform through a conversation among experts and community leaders to provide insight and to re-engage the community.
The objective of these conversations is to provide a forum to raise awareness and increase community engagement on the consent decree and how it affects members of our community. The United Way's mission is being a voice for those in need. We know that there are so many underlying aspects of poverty which are hard to see and equally hard to discuss and solve. And certainly systemic racism is a main contributor to generational poverty that has afflicted our community for far too long. Not one organization can solve inequity, and I am humbled to be only a small part of a group of esteemed community leaders from whom you will have the privilege to hear in this series.
For 108 years, the Cleveland branch of the NAACP has worked to improve the political, educational, social, and economic status of minority groups, to eliminate racial prejudice, and to keep the public aware of the adverse effects of racial discrimination, and to take lawful action to secure its elimination. This community conversation and the monthly topics we will address related to the Cleveland Consent Decree are right in line with the work our organization has addressed and championed every day for over a century right here in Cleveland. Through this series, you will hear about the current status of the Cleveland Consent Decree and the future of policing in the city. And as the name of this event suggests, this is a two-way dialogue, and we want to hear from you tonight and every month in this series as we tackle these various topics.
I'd like to thank Cuyahoga Community College and Rockwell Automation for sponsoring and making this series possible. I would also like to thank the City Club of Cleveland for partnering with us in hosting the series of events, and WOVU for simulcasting this evening's discussion live on 95.9 FM. We'd also like to thank all of our community partners.
Good evening. Thank you all for being present with us this evening for the 10th part in the 11th series session. It is a wonderful honor to be here with you this evening. My name is Crystal Bryant. I currently serve as the Executive Director for our Cleveland branch of the NAACP. Tonight's topic is youth and policing. Police practices are often primarily in place to manage difficult interactions with adults and apply the same rules of force against children as they do for adults. Few police departments in the country have clear policies on how police should interact with children, but Cleveland is among the first in the country to enact specific rules in this area. The Cleveland policy will require that officers consider factors like the perceived age, physical build, and emotional state of anyone under the age of 18 before using force. The consent decree mandates that the Cleveland Division of Police will create formal and informal mechanisms that facilitate ongoing communication between the CDP and many Cleveland communities it serves. Policies focused on youth will support the community and problem-oriented policing values set forth in the consent decree. Tonight's conversation will review youth policies and what still needs to be done to continue to build trust within the community. Tonight's moderator is Alex Stokes, anchor with Fox 8 News. Alex began her journalism career as an intern at Fox 8 in 2017. She then took a job in Huntsville, Alabama at WHNT News 19 as a digital producer and reporter. Within the year, she became the weekend morning anchor and producer. Among her work in Huntsville, Alex produced a 30-minute special, The Church Street Story, highlighting the citizens' African-American contributions to the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. Since rejoining the Fox 8 News family, Alex has won 2 Emmy Awards. Alex has firm roots in Cleveland. Her grandfather, Louis Stokes, the great uncle Carl Stokes, were involved in the area's politics for decades and shared a deep love for the city with their family. Alex graduated from the George Washington University with a major in history and a minor in communications. I am honored to introduce tonight's conversation moderator, Alex Stokes.
See, after all these, this time on Zoom, we're still having issues with muting. Thank you, Crystal, so much for that introduction as well. Thank you to Augie and Danielle for introducing this forum. I want to thank United Way of Greater Cleveland and the Cleveland branch of the NAACP for inviting me to moderate this critical discussion. And it has been quite the year of many important discussions. And so as we start to close that out, very excited to see what discussions we can have together on this topic. I also want to thank the City Club of Cleveland for hosting this series of events and WOVU for simulcasting this evening's discussion live on 95.9 FM, and WOIO Channel 19 is also live streaming this discussion on cleveland19.com. So that everyone understands how we will interact as a community this evening, we will begin with questions that I prepared for this evening's conversation. I do want to thank everyone for tuning in this evening. There will be a public question and answer segment at about 7 p.m. when questions from the community will be heard and shared with our panel. You can start asking your general questions at any time that is convenient to you during this evening's program. If something pops in your head, we will make every attempt to get all those questions answered. You can text your questions to 216-307-5632. Again, that is 216-307-5632. We will be reminding you of that phone number throughout the rest of this hour as something pops in your head. Again, you can just text that number. At this time, though, I would like to introduce our panel of experts. We have a wonderful panel for you all tonight to talk about youth and policing. Tonight, we are first joined by Gabriella Celeste, Policy Director for Case Western University's Schubert Center for Child Studies and is co-director of the Childhood Studies Program and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. Also would like to introduce Zerai Hitchcock. She is a Cuyahoga Community College graduate, pre-med biology student at Cleveland State University, and will be graduating with the class of 2022, an entrepreneur and a radio show co-host. We also have Brandon Tisdale. He began his law enforcement career in 2003. During the course of his 18-year career, he has served as a police officer with the Northeast Regional Sewer District, a police officer for the city of East Cleveland, a correctional officer for the Cleveland City Jail, and as a police officer for Cuyahoga Community College. We also have this evening with us Timothy Tramble. He is president and chief executive officer of the St. Luke's Foundation, a health equity nonprofit. Tim also serves on the Cleveland Police Monitoring Team. We also have with us Chief Calvin Williams. Chief Calvin D. Williams is the City of Cleveland's 40th Chief of Police. Chief Williams was appointed to the Division of Police on February 24th, 1986. He was assigned to the SWAT unit where he served there for 9 years. And last but not least, from the United States Attorney's Office, we have civil rights investigator Michael Ivanovich. Present on the call, though you might not see him, he will provide clarifying comments and share critical points with the community as needed regarding the consent decree. And when he does, you will see him at that time. Tonight, we have Alicia Ellis. She will present the community questions. Ms. Ellis is the founder and creator of the multimedia platform Masleray. She is also the co-founder of the women's empowerment group Fierce Women on Board. So if you've tuned into any of these discussions prior throughout the year, again, there's that public comment section, but today we are very lucky to be joined by 3 students from Cuyahoga Community College who will also be participating in that question and answer segment with our panel. Our students are Austin Keller, Taiwo Kalawale, and Andrew Sobey. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to lend your expertise and perspective to tonight's dialogue, and let's get right into it. So as we talk about youth and policing, I first just want to lay the groundwork for this conversation. Gabriella, I'd like to direct the first question to you. As we talk about young people and their interactions with police, we first have to understand the subject we're talking about. So can you please explain, how do young people differentiate from adults when dealing with trouble, crisis, intense stress? And in addition to that, why then is it important for police departments to have a separate set of policies or ways that they deal with our younger population?
Thanks so much for that question, Alex, and thank you for having me as part of this panel. Listen, kids are different from adults. We all know that from personal experience, but we also know it from what research tells us about their brain development. We know it from what the law has told us now in terms of how we want to protect young people, how they're especially vulnerable. And so when it comes to interactions with law enforcement, those interactions are often stressful, highly charged. And so things like how a kid may think, how they may process information, take time to process information, the fact that they're not as quick to necessarily perceive risk or perceive risk in the same way. It may be harder to self-regulate, their impulse control issues that exist. There's sensitivity to threat that exists that we know in terms of child brain development that's different. And this also impacts their decision-making, how they're able to make decision-making and anticipate kind of future consequences. So all of that, is heightened, certainly in situations where they may come into contact, not just with law enforcement, but that just happens to be a particularly stressful situation. But it's not just that kids are more vulnerable and different developmentally from adults, but it's also that our Black and brown kids are especially vulnerable. And we know that from research and interactions with law enforcement, that they don't get the benefit of the protection of childhood in the same way that white kids get. And so I think when we're talking about Cleveland and our kids in Cleveland, where we have a large population of Black and brown kids, we have to be especially attentive to these issues of bias that have an intersection with age and have a particularly potentially harmful result with our kids.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. Zaraya, I want to continue with you and just ask, as the youngest person on our panel, what is how can you kind of help people understand where young people are coming from when they see a police officer or have to interact with a police officer?
Well, first I'll say it's a lot of distrust, and I know for a fact that a lot of the distrust comes from not just personal experience, but also experiences that we see other people have. Typically, when we see other young people dealing with the police, it's never just like a police officer coming to a school and just talking to the kids and just introducing themselves as someone getting arrested for drugs or someone getting arrested for or being harassed, like a stop and frisk situation. And even further than that, but like actual media representation of how police and young people deal with one another. And that can cause a barrier between police and youth, where it's like, okay, I don't trust you because I've seen the way you've dealt with people who look like me, and you don't trust me based off of the people who are my age that you've dealt with, what the media has shown you about me. So we're both in this weird case where we're both being biased toward one another, not necessarily just off of personal experience, but off of everything else that we're seeing about one another.
Sarai, thank you so much. Unless another panelist wants to add to that particular question I'd asked to start off with Gabriella and Sarai, I do want to turn to the other side of this discussion, which is the police. So Chief, to you, as Crystal had mentioned, few departments in our country have a youth policing policy. And so I wanted to ask you, as among one of the first in the country to enact these specific rules and how they should interact with children, what was important to you in shaping the policy? And what do your officers need to always take with them from what they're learning into the field?
Well, thanks, Alex. I really appreciate the opportunity to respond, but I do want to jump on that first question real quick. Mrs. Hitchcock is wise beyond her years. She kind of hit the nail on the head on some of the issues that occur between police officers and the youth in our community. A lot of it is perception. Some of it is the way they've seen officers treat other individuals like themselves. And some of it is based on their true experiences with a police officer. So we put this policy in place to ensure that officers have a guideline, that they have the necessary tools in writing that basically dictate how we as a police agency will interact with the youth in our community. But let me back up about 8 or 9 years. Back in 2012 and 13, the city actually partnered with Partnership for a Safer Cleveland, Mike Walker's organization, some others, and we actually brought some folks here in Cleveland to talk about police interaction with youth. And some of the folks that came to town, there was a professor from Ohio State University, Strategies for Youth kind of got involved in this. Is where we first got our taste of the not so much the behavioral differences, but those biochemical differences between adults and our youth. And when you look at it on that microbiology level, some of what our kids do is kind of explain. There are different reactions from a 30-year-old than a 16-year-old. And our officers were involved in that training, those seminars and the training that we had after that, and got a better understanding of why some of the things happen when we interact with youth, all in an effort to have those interactions more positive, to have more positive outcomes. So we put this policy in place to really put on paper what we've been doing since 2012 and 13. Our officers attended a training en masse called, I didn't like the title, but called Policing the Teen Brain. And Lisa Thoreau out of Strategies for Youth and I talked a lot of hours, a lot of times about that title. I love the program. I just didn't like that title, Policing the Teen Brain, because we're not policing teens. We're actually trying to interact with our teens and have better outcomes. So we put together a 9-page policy that I signed earlier this year that instructs officers on how they are expected to and how they'll be held accountable for their interactions with the youth in our community. And it goes into a ton of things. You know, it starts with having respect, you know, being professional, being equal in their treatment, and also understanding and treating youth in an age-appropriate manner. And that's important because not all of our kids, you know, from let's say 12 to 18 can be treated exactly the same way based on their age. So it has to be age appropriate to what that youth development is. So that's just in a nutshell why we put this policy in place. I do believe that other agencies are going to follow suit across this country because we see a lot of the negative interactions. And we definitely see the need. When I talk to other police chiefs across the country, we have to train our officers better. They have to have a clear understanding of why certain things happen so that we can have better outcomes with our youth. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. As a quick follow-up question, have you seen interest from other agencies across the country towards your particular policy?
Yes, we have. And again, we've been in this process since 2012. So over those years, before I became chief, I became chief in 2014. So as a deputy chief with field operations, I've had conversations not just with our local agencies, but agencies across the country. And definitely once I became chief, you know, we pushed this out, you know, across the country. We just finished last week Major City Chiefs Conference. 66 largest policing agencies across this country come together every year and talk about things just like this. So Lisa is familiar with a lot of those police chiefs around the country and Strategies for Youth, our organization. And we constantly push out, you know, you have to have a policy. You have to get that training, that knowledge, that understanding to your baseline officers, your frontline officers, to make sure we have more positive outcomes when we interact with our young folks.
Thank you. Officer Tisdale, I also wanted to follow up with you. What do you take into the field with you, into work with you when you are knowing that you'll be around younger people?
Well, also take into consideration, thank you. Also take into consideration mental illness. I'm seeing that a lot more in our youth, substance abuse and things like that. So I keep open mind in interacting with them, because sometimes we assume that it's just the same old routine call, and it's not. There's nothing routine in police work. But I also keep an open mind and understanding that some of them come from broken homes. Some of them, like I believe, like Zariah stated, the first interaction with law enforcement is usually negative. And I remember as a young Black man growing up, I had negative experiences with officers as well. But I also took it as a learning tool to, if I'm ever put in a position, to not treat someone like that, as far as that goes, when it comes to being in uniform or abusing my authority or things like that.
Thank you, Officer Tisdale. Gabriella, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for saying that, Officer Tisdale, because actually, even before the interactions with youth policy, the Mental Health Response Advisory Committee, as part of the consent decree, included recognizing crisis intervention and the importance of crisis intervention, included youth-specific guidance in its policy with the CDP. So the chief is right that I think this work has begun long before this interactions with youth policy itself was adopted this year. I don't know if the strategies for youth actually came in and did the training until I think it was March 2015. But in any case, those conversations began earlier, and that training has been so important. And it's begun. We've recognized that kids in crisis have also unique challenges and issues that we should be addressing. So I just appreciate you lifting that up.
And also, if I could add one more thing, I would like to say, this past summer, I took the CIT training, and I know someone mentioned it before, the crisis intervention training, and that was some very helpful training. And not only that, I learned from experiences from my fellow officers. And then on our last day, we did scenarios out at our public safety training institute with actors and actresses, and it was very eye-opening to see how people react to certain situations, especially dealing with the youth and things like that. And that's very helpful and tools that I took on out here in the field when I interact with them. And then it helps us share ideas and things that work, things that we can improve on and do better when it comes to interacting with the community and the youth.
Thank you both. My next question is to both Chief Williams and to Mr. Tramble. Mr. Tramble, I'll start with you because you all, as part of the monitoring team, release a semi-annual report and kind of are grading you are grading basically the Division of Police on how they're doing on the consent decree, but you're also evaluating how they work with youth and their interactions with youth. With this policy, first I want to ask you, what are you seeing? Is everything that you see in there something you want to see? Are there things that you'd like to see added to the policy at all as we continue? And Chief Williams, I'll come to you after.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say on behalf of the monitoring team, I want to give the opportunity to just acknowledge what's taking place here with the United Way and the NAACP, bringing this to the community. We worked tirelessly when we started 6 years ago to really engage the community around the consent decree, and we really hadn't accomplished anything like we have with this partnership. So we do want to just acknowledge and appreciate what this partnership has done in amplifying the importance of the community being involved in police reform. That being said, in regards to the policy around interactions with youth, if you read it, it's common sense, right? It's like basic common sense and basic human decency kind of things, right? It's related to understanding that handcuffing a child can be a traumatic experience for them, right? And recognizing that and recognizing you might want to consider other things before you get to that point, right? It's basic things like making sure that you document that you call their parents and making sure that you document that you call their parents. There's nothing that, without the policy that you shouldn't be doing anyway. So that's number one. Secondly, in regards to all other areas of the consent decree that deals with the youth, we know that if we're going to be successful at this, it's going to be because we properly nurtured the growth and development of our youth, because they are our future. And part of that is how we deal with them when they are in a state of crisis, and recognizing that they are in a state of crisis when, rather than being deviant or being or doing a criminal act, recognizing sometimes that they might be engaged in activities that they don't even recognize as a criminal act, right? And so sometimes what I'm getting to is that sometimes we have to deal with youth in a way of providing a service as opposed to disciplining them. And it's a lot more that could be said about this in regards to our criminal justice system, in regards to how we treat our youth when it comes to the juvenile detention center. It's a lot that we could talk about in that regard, but the most important thing is that we recognize that they are different when it comes to their neurological state and development, and that we have to deal with them in a developmental appropriate way, as has been mentioned.
So Chief, I want to ask you as a piggyback, what are you seeing work with the policy, and is there always room for additions or improvement to what is there?
Well, definitely, there's always room for improvement, Alex. The policy, I think, is a great first step for us. As I stated earlier, and as Mr. Trambo kind of hit the point, that a lot of the policy is common sense, things that we should be doing anyway. I go a step further to say that we memorialize what we've been doing all along, what we've been doing since 2014, 15, 16. So now it's in writing. So now officers definitely can be held accountable to the strictest part of this policy. The handcuffing, we will not handcuff a juvenile that's under 13 years old unless it's for a violent crime and that person is totally out of control. We didn't do that in the past, and we don't do it now, but now it's in writing. So the officers clearly understand that. But I just want to make one final point on the policy itself. The policy, this youth interaction policy, is not a requirement of the consent decree. Again, this is something that we worked on since 2012, 13, and 14, and now it's come to fruition in the policy itself. It kind of took a backseat to a lot of the use of force things, de-escalation, things like that. A lot of the search and seizure policies that we had to develop early on in the consent decree process. But I'm glad that we finally got it done. There's a lot of folks out there that help us. Gabriella knows those people and what we're talking about. But this is, I think, a great first step. I think that our officers clearly know now, even our new officers that weren't around in 2014. So that's why it's important that it's memorialized in a document that officers can clearly read, clearly understand, and definitely have that positive outcomes and positive interactions with our youth.
Gabriella?
Yeah, thank you. First, I do want to say that this was this process of the policy actually did not start until after we had the loss of Tamir Rice in our community. And I don't want to get into a back and forth about timing on this, but I don't feel comfortable going further in this conversation today about youth and policing without acknowledging the loss of Tamir Rice, who was 12 years old, standing, between a rec center and his school, playing with a toy gun, and who was killed in under 2 seconds. And I would hope very much that not just this policy, but the training and all of the work that's been done as part of this consent decree, because the findings, were filed about a week and a half after the loss of Tamir Rice. And even Vanita Gupta, who was the Assistant Attorney General at the time, lifted up his name to say, he's helped us all understand as a country the challenges that we have around excessive force. So my hope is that, yes, there are a lot of common sense things here in the policy, and we have leadership with our chief that's been clearly around for a long time here, but it will take a whole community to actually to realize the best intent of what we're trying to do with both policy and training. And so one of the big things, for example, in the policy, as the chief alluded to with even with handcuffs, is officers can use their discretion in diverting kids, from the criminal justice system. And we need community programs to step up and be available to support officers when they are interacting with young people. We need, whether those are mental health programs or behavioral health, but also arts programs and literacy aid schools, those kinds of things. And I think we also need to continue in the training, some of which has happened. I want to just say, I want to do a shout out to the reverse ride along that started also under this leadership. And Boys and Girls Club just recently, they had young people do a training with the new Academy of officers. And it was incredible. It was these young people were doing training that I'd never seen before with such thought. And I think the feedback from the officers also was really positive. So it's a lot of work that's been done, and a lot more that I think we have to go.
Chief Williams, I'm coming to you, but I just want to remind everyone who is watching this evening, you can text questions to 216-307-5632. Again, 216-307-5632 for the public comment portion, which will be around 7 p.m. Chief Williams, you wanted to add something?
Yes, Alex, I just want to clarify a couple of things, and maybe Gabrielle and I disagree on timing and dates. I just don't want people to get the idea that, the only reason that this policy is in effect is because of the tragic loss of Tamir Rice. Although that's a part of this entire process, but there are a lot of things that happen with the tragic loss of Tamir Rice that didn't have anything to do with his age. And that's probably the biggest downfall in this for us is division. But the officers that responded did not know his age at the time. And I do get the community sentiment about, had things been slowed down or other things have happened, that tragedy wouldn't have happened. But this didn't just start with Tamir Rice. It started way before that. And the timing of the Department of Justice's investigation started in 2013 and culminated in 2014. And of course, again, I was the first to say that, Tamir Rice didn't do anything wrong that day. And I said that the day after it happened, and I'll keep saying that. And this policy, I think, is really going to help us. But I just don't want people to say that because of Tamir Rice, we instituted this policy. That's one of the factors, but not the only factor.
Thank you, Chief. I wanted to piggyback on something you said. So let's talk about perception of youth by officers. Zerai, let's start with you. Let's talk about a little bit about minorities, Black and brown kids, as well as how they are perceived by police. I mean, is that something that is a concern to your peers?
Oh yeah, definitely. Tim actually when we did rehearsal, he brought up a really great point that Black children are always viewed as way older than we are. And I can say that for a fact, since that time I was like 12 years old, there were literally times when people thought I was an adult. And part of it may have been the way I looked. It might have been my maturity. I mean, it could be debated why people thought that, but I literally had instances where people would really think I was an adult. I got a time when a guy, he wasn't being predatory at all. He invited me to his party, and he was an adult. And when he found out that I was a kid, he was like, "Oh no, you're not invited anymore," because he really didn't think that I was a kid. He thought I was an adult. And that's something that I've noticed with a lot of my Black peers. We're always viewed as a lot older than we are, even when we're literally children, not even just teenagers, but literally at 12 years old, people thinking that I was a grown woman. And that can affect the way you're perceived, because if somebody is instantly viewing you as an adult, whether because it's your race, whether it's because of your height, your body type, your skin complexion, anything, they're going to treat you as an adult. And people don't treat children the way they treat an adult, whether they're a bigot or not. You just typically don't treat adults the way you treat children. And that can be very dangerous for us, because even though thankfully I didn't have any bad experiences, people viewing a 12-year-old girl as a grown woman is never going to be safe for her in any situation, especially if she's alone, because people are perceiving her based off of what they're seeing, and they're acting on that. And if you see someone who's a 16-year-old and you're viewing them as a 25-year-old, you're instantly, as a police officer, and I'm not a police officer, so I can't speak for police, but I'm thinking about how it would be if I was a police officer. If I'm looking at someone and they look at like a 25-year-old and they're really 16, I'm looking at this person like, okay, they might be someone who has a gun or has a knife and is thinking about killing someone who's in this crime scene or that scene, versus if they're 16, I know they're 16, I'm not thinking that they're gonna pull out a gun and shoot anyone or stab anyone. So the way I'm gonna address them it's just not the same.
Thank you, Zerai. So Officer Tisdale, as someone who is in the field, when you are in a situation where you have a child who may appear older, how do you handle that situation, not knowing their age?
Well, once again, just keeping an open mind and understanding, depending on the call, because in my days of East Cleveland, I dealt with a lot of runaways, and I would find that they come from a broken home or things like that, to the point that they would look, just like Zariah said, older than they really were. And then once you get to talking to them, you see the maturity level or their IQ just wouldn't be that of someone that would be of an adult age. So that's how I dealt with that when it comes to dealing with those type of situations. Now, when it comes to dealing with a lot of the kids or the violent crimes or things like that, once again, keep an open mind. But what amazed me is what these youth have been exposed to at such a young age, to the level of crimes that they're doing, and still trying to find sometimes, even when I've always understood that sometimes the youth can be the most dangerous because they haven't lived long enough, they don't understand the consequences, and they have no fear. And a lot of times they're being raised by the streets and things like that. So that being said, I would always try and find a common bond, whether it's sports or music, to try and break the ice, to try and get them to open up, whatever the case may be, to have that line of conversation, whether it be in a positive light or even in a negative light, unfortunately, sometimes.
Thank you, Chief.
Sorry, trying to get off mute. Again, Ms. Hitchcock is wise beyond her years. She talks about that perception again. And there was a part in our conversations in the consent decree process, as well as our policy development, when there was a huge back and forth about perceived age of an individual. And we kind of fought a lot against having that phrase in a lot of our policies for the very reason Ms. Hitchcock mentions. That perception is different among different folks. It's different among Black and white folks. It's different among old and young folks. It's different. And if you're just basing it on your perception of that person's age, then we're doing a disservice to what's going on out there in our communities. So we fought against that, tried not to have it in a lot of our policies, especially our use of force policy. And we tried to make sure that our policies reflect what those acts are that are occurring, what that call for service actually is. And then our officers, again, with additional training and other factors, can make what should turn out to be a better decision in that interaction with those folks. So I just wanted to put that out there. And the last thing, and I hate to be morbid right now, but tomorrow morning, I'm heading to Washington, D.C. And it's for the police memorial. And we're honoring an officer that was killed in the line of duty, Detective James Skirnovitz. And that officer was killed by a 19-year-old and two 16-year-olds, killed. So when you talk about perception, when you talk about things that happen out there, our officers have to be aware of what's going on. They have to be perceptive of things that are going on, but you have to take a look at the acts that are happening around you, what that call for service is, and then you have to deal with it appropriately, professionally and respectfully with our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriella, you wanted to add?
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to acknowledge Zari for what you lifted up there. And it's something that we see bear out in a lot of the research. There's research done by Dr. Philip Adebagoff around how Black youth are typically after the age of 10 seen as on average 4.5 years older if they're perceived of committing a crime than white youth. and are more likely to face, police violence as a result. And I'm so sorry, Chief, that you're heading to DC for that memorial. And obviously any life loss is a loss for our community. I will say that kids are the victims so much of both violence that's happening in our community, but in particular also police use of force generally. And there's new research actually by Dr. Golf and his team that shows that Black children are more than twice as likely as white adults to be victims of police use of force. So I'm not saying this is not Cleveland specific, and I acknowledge that, but the reality is our kids are often really the victims who are facing a lot of this force. And we saw examples of that, of course, in the DOJ investigation as well, which is why we're all here tonight.
Thank you. And Mr. Turnbull, did you want to add anything? I think you're muted.
I want to echo Gabriella's comments in regards to just, paying respect to the loss of a life. That's always tragic, regardless to where it is. I always say that the best race in our world is the human race. So anytime any life is lost, it's tragic. That being said, I think that we also have to recognize that going back to how we deal with our youth during traumatic situations, we can be creating future criminals, and we have to recognize that. And in many cases, that is what has been the case in our communities, that based on the way that they were treated, and I think that I'm not, a neuroscience or not scientist or anything, but based on things that I've read, based on the way people are treated and people are perceived and how they perceive that they are perceived by others, influence how they act and the kind of behaviors they tend to gravitate towards. And so it's important that we get it right in regards to how we deal with them early. And again, how we nurture and the development and growth of our youth. And if we do that right, we'll have less youth at 16. If they're being managed right and their behaviors at 12, we'll have less of them being perpetrators of crimes when they're older. But we in many cases, we create it.
Thank you. So let's talk more about community upbringing. Obviously, as we've mentioned, the consent decree it's not youth specific, but it certainly includes youth because youth is part of the community as that community trust is being repaired. So first, Ms. Hitchcock, I know you had wanted to speak a bit about how to build that trust, especially from your perspective. So what would you recommend to police departments, officers on where a good starting point is?
Yes, I did want to touch on that. I want to touch on the fact that there's a certain amount of care that occurs when you know someone and when you're familiar with someone. You can just look at the way you deal with people who you know versus people who you don't know. The way you deal with your siblings, your parents, your friends, your family is totally different than you deal with some random person in the grocery store, some random person walking on the street. And part of that familiarity, it causes comfortability, and with comfortability comes care, and it can come with love and other things. And it's necessary for youth and police to have instances where we're dealing with one another outside of just someone being arrested or someone being questioned about a crime. Because if a police officer who I've seen in my school multiple times comes to my school because there's some drug situation going on, I'm going to react a lot differently if I know the police officer and he or she knows me. Then I'm going to react if it's just a random pop-up and I've never seen this person outside of when something dramatic or crime related is going on. And it's necessary for that type of relationship to be established in order for trust and comfortability to be established, because you're simply never going to be comfortable with someone who you don't know. That's literally a part of human evolution. We feel comfortable with those who we know and who we're familiar with. So I think that it's heavy to emphasize that we're going to have situations where we deal with one another outside of crime related situations in order for us to build that trust, in order to build comfortability and care and love, et cetera, whatever you want to call it.
And Tim, let me bounce back to you with the current evaluation of the policy. How do you see that trust being built by the Division of Police? You're muted again.
I'm sorry. I'll just say that Zerai is the star of the show, right? I mean, because she's hitting all of the points. I'm going to share something with you guys that's very personable to really bring her point home. My nephew was coached by Chief Kevin Williams in Muni League, right? And I will tell you that when it comes to the question of police engagement with youth from a programmatic standpoint, they've always done a great job. He did that before the consent decree. He was my nephew's coach, before the consent decree ever happened, before he was ever a chief, right? So, there are some of our officers that do that. And I say some, and I think that some is when you look at how many there are, it's not that many, but the youth, of course, relate to him. Of course, my nephew saw him as a mentor, saw him as someone that he was comfortable with, right? Of course, and all of the other officer coaches that are part of that. But it's not the programming interactions, it's the everyday when I'm walking down the street, when I'm going to school, when we're playing a game of football, just kids getting together, basketball on a basketball court, and the police drive by. And one other point I want to make is, the relevance, the relatability. And this is what Zerai is talking about, right? We got to have more officers of the community, because if you're not of the community, you don't know all of the cultural, interactions, cultural norms. We got to really push that. And to the chief's credit, I do have to acknowledge that he is pushing that. Zerai has a radio show on WOBU A to Z radio, not to give a shameless plug, but people need to hear our bright young talent, right? And I hear Chief Williams on WOVU really pushing the need for individuals of the community to apply to be police officers. That is essential, because if we understand, as she eloquently outlined, if we are able to relate to the youth, if we are able to see ourselves, and anyone we're able to see ourselves in, there is a compassion, there is an empathy that is natural.
Chief, I'm going to go to you, but I also had wanted to ask you as well, how do you instill that view of the world that you have into new officers as they come in as well?
Excellent question, Alex. And you probably read my mind, because that was going to be the question that I answered. I want to thank Tim for those kudos. Immensely enjoyed coaching Muni League football. Love it. Definitely.
Chief, I think we might have lost you. I'm not sure if it doesn't look like you're muted, but we can't hear you. All right, well, we'll see if we can troubleshoot that, because definitely want to hear what you have to say. I just can't hear anything. But in the meantime, unless I can't hear anything. Gabriella?
Well, I just, until we get the chief's mic working again, I just wanted to say on the trust piece that it absolutely is about recruitment. And we know largely the newer members to the force have much more positive things to say about young people than folks who've been on the force for a longer time. We know that from some of the surveys we've done and conversations. And so supporting that, not just in recruitment, but then in incentives and in supporting officers who take the extra time to actually, engage positively with young people, I think and be recognized in that way is something we could do a better job of. I will say, though, I think it's also important to balance out this idea of sort of over surveilling our kids. There's a fine line between what, coaching a team that's, that kind of interaction or having positive interactions on the street versus a constant sort of presence. And we know, again, that that's something that, at least in my conversations with young people around Cleveland, and in the research, that there is a sense, particularly from Black and brown youth, that police presence is something that is constant and stressful, and that in fact I think it was Dr. Carter said, who talks about, for young children, navigating police for young Black children, it's like a developmental milestone that white kids don't have to face in the same kind of way. So I think there's a difference between a positive presence and a surveilling, kind of presence that I just want to point out when we talk about trust building with young people.
I believe we're still, Chief, can you just give us a 1-2? I think we're still working on that. So while we are, Officer Tisdale, give us your experience of what has worked successfully in bridging the gap between the police force and the community.
Well, to touch off what Soraya and Mr. Tramble said, I think it's very important to have officers that are vested in the community. I lived in East Cleveland before I was a police officer. And so I had an opportunity to understand the community and the clientele I was serving on a day-to-day basis, which helped me in my career of better serving them and helping them better understand me as far as the job I needed to do and the level of service I wanted to provide.
Thank you. I think we might have heard.
Can you hear
me? Yes, I can hear you now. Can you go ahead and please resume your answer from earlier?
I'm sorry, I lost audio here. I lost the last 3 conversations. But what I was going to say, Alex, real quick, is that the way we approach it as division, the way I've been telling new officers and talking to new officers since I became chief is, you treat people out there the way that you would expect another police officer to treat a person that you love, period. You treat people that you encounter the way that you would want another police officer to treat your mother, your son, your daughter, your cousin, your aunt. And if you do that, a lot of these encounters that we have with our community will be positive. This policy is not a, community engagement policy. It's just a guide on how we treat youth. And out of that, we hope we get more positive interactions that lead to what Tim was talking about, closer connections for our officers with those youth that we kind of interact with every day. So, if we can get to the point where we can at least have hello, how you doing, then we can take that next step into actually having the kids out there that have had that encounter with that officer now actually know who that officer is. And we're doing a lot of that already. Are we doing it to the level that I want us to be, that I think the consent decree requires? No, we're not there yet. But we have positive interactions with our folks every day. We have a pipeline program that we've been growing for years with kids that our officers interact with all the time. We go into the schools, we go into the rec centers, we go into the community centers. There are officers that day in and day out that you would never know that actually stop and play basketball with kids. I tell this story sometimes. I was actually on the scene of a homicide. It was a homicide of a 6-year-old. Traumatic situation, terrible situation, should not have happened. One of the officers on that scene opened the trunk of his police car to get some more crime scene tape to increase that crime scene to keep people out so we can do our jobs. And as he opened his trunk, as I was about to walk by, I saw a bag of teddy bears and a huge bag of little footballs. And I asked him, "Where did you get that?" He said, "My partner and I bought it because when we see kids out here, we stop, we talk to them, and we give them a football or a teddy bear, and we actually take the time to interact with those kids." And that was a 4th district officer. I can't even remember who it was, but that's something that he and his partner did on their own, and they were both Caucasian officers, they did on their own without me saying, hey, this is what I want you to do. Money out of their own pockets. So we do things like that on a consistent basis. We just have to have a lot more of that.
Thank you. I want to move quickly, and before I do, to this second to last question, just reminding everyone we are just a few minutes away from our public question segment. And if you have any questions, you can text them to 216-307-5632. Again, 216-307-5632. Ms. Celeste brought this up earlier, and I wanted to kind of shift our focus a little bit. You know, there's a lot on police. Police have a big job to do. And she had mentioned other services, other things that could be available in situations of crisis with a young person that might be a better alternative. So before I circle back to you, I first wanted to ask you, Ms. Hitchcock, what would be helpful to young people? What types of services would be helpful when they're maybe faced with a problem, or their parents are faced with a problem, or an adult is around them and faced with a problem, so that we avoid even getting to this part of the conversation we're having tonight?
You know what? I just thought about something. I think something that might be helpful in the future is like a hotline that isn't 911, but is still someone who's in law enforcement, so you can understand how to de-escalate situations. I'm going to assume, and Chief Calvin and Brandon can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm going to assume that police officers know about ways to de-escalate situations. And I think it would be helpful if at some point in the future there was some type of hotline that youth could call just to have questions about de-escalating situations with their friends or with their family members or community members, so that the civilians know how to handle situations before it gets to that point, or to even know how to de-escalate a situation so it doesn't get to the point, like Alex said, where the police is even needed.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Celeste, I want to go back to you. Can you kind of just round out, I know you had made the point earlier, but since we're back on it, what are some of the tools already available that could be helpful to adults in these situations?
Sure. Well, first, Zerai, I don't know if you know this, but the country is about to roll out a new 988 hotline for people in crisis, particularly mental health crisis and suicide, sort of suicidal thoughts. But it will be for, potentially for anyone in crisis, and it's to have an alternative to 911, and there also will be sort of connected with programming that can be first responders that are more trained in mental health sort of informed responses. So that's something that I think we are looking forward to sort of working with partners on making that happen. There's a model called the Mobile Response and Stabilization Services that's going to be just for youth. That's also something that we're looking at trying to really build out in our community. But there's other things that are more informal. Well, of course, I want to acknowledge groups like the Cleveland Peacemakers that really come out and try and intervene and prevent and work on the streets with people who have may get into beefs and ways to sort of try and resolve those and de-escalate. But also the other a program that we have is something called the Children Who Witness Violence program. So kids who may witness violence actually are obviously traumatized, and how do we help address those concerns and intervene then? I want to acknowledge Dr. Ed Barksdale and his anti-fragility initiative at the UH Rainbow Children's, again, a violence prevention program to reduce retaliation and do violence interruption in the hospital setting. So there's a few things that are happening, but I think another thing that we don't do enough of is restorative justice, or thinking about how to use restorative practices in our community. There's a speaker actually in Cleveland tomorrow, Dr. Fania Davis, who's going to be talking about restorative justice practices. So I think there's a lot potentially that we could be making more robust in terms of intervention and prevention, in addition to those other kinds of just positive youth experiences, supports for our young people.
Thank you very much. All right, I would like to bring in our wonderful students that are going to be joining us this evening to ask questions to our panelists. So first up, I believe we have Austin Keller. Austin, will you please ask your first question?
Actually, my first question has already been answered actually numerous times over already this evening.
Would you like to ask your second question?
Sure. My second question is, what can schools do to prevent juvenile delinquency among the youth within the community?
All right. So to that question, I would like to bring that to Tim. Would you like to take that?
What can schools do to prevent juvenile delinquency?
Among the youth, yeah.
Among the youth. So it's interesting that she would ask me. I wasn't expecting that Alex was going to ask me, but I think it does go back to my earlier points, right? I think that we have to recognize that, you know, kids are like flowers, right? And if you don't water it, you're not going to get a beautiful petals, right? You have to water it, you have to nurture it, you have to plant it in nutrient-rich soil. So I think that, you know, we get what we put into our youth, and we have to recognize that we have to work towards nurturing that growth and development. At the end of the day, if we got kids that are deviant when they're 16 and 18 and 20 years old, then there's something that we did when they were 8 and 9 and 10 that we should have done, or something that we didn't do. So we just have to love on them, and again, not always look at certain things they do from a punitive standpoint, but from a supportive standpoint. What do we do to address that issue, address that social emotional need that they're lacking?
All right. I see a hand up from Chief Williams. I see a lot of head nodding from Zerai. So Chief Williams, I'll go to you first, and then Zerai, I want you to follow up, okay? Chief, go ahead, sorry. Oh, we can't hear you. Do you want to do it through the, oh, there we go.
All right. Trying to work through this. Tim makes a great point. And probably the key to his point is the we. That pronoun of we kind of symbolizes all this. Although we're concentrating on police-youth interactions, it's a we thing. It's a societal thing. It's not just police. We can have a perfect police agency. Perfect. Doesn't violate constitutional rights, doesn't have any uses of force, doesn't make any mistakes, and we're still going to have the societal problems that we have. So if we continue to look at a lot of these things, and I think Tim kind of made that point, if we continue to look at these things from what can the police do better to make things better, we miss the whole boat of all those other things that need to be done way before that kid interacts with a police officer or should interact with a police officer that can make that interaction that positive. We're out here on the basketball court, playing basketball, on the football field, in the classroom, and it's positive. So I just want people to, kind of keep that in mind, although the focus and the spotlight is on us. And, I don't mind that because we have to do better as an agency, as a law enforcement profession. But there are a lot of other agencies, organizations, institutions that need to get on board and do their part in this whole thing that affects our society.
Thank you, Zerai.
Yes, I just wanted to piggyback off of what Tim said. Although I am pre-med biology major, part of my major requirements have been taking psychology and sociology courses. And I can say that with my psychology courses, it was emphasized a lot in psychology, how much foundations emphasize how you act as an adult, how you act as a teenager, and just in general life until the day that you die. And I think we all know, even though I'm not a carpenter, the house is only as great as the foundation is, and the plant is only as great as the roots are. So it's necessary to address the issues and to groom people for greatness, as opposed to trying to correct them once they do something wrong.
Thank you. Officer Tisdale, you've also spent time on campus. So, obviously, I know we're talking about all grades of school, but what are some of your suggestions?
Well, going back to what Zerai said and Mr. Tramble and the question with delinquency. My first job when I first became a police officer, I worked for Cleveland Municipal School District. And at the time when I was there, we had a high delinquency, issue, truancy, things like that. So a lot of times I would be called to deal with it. So from there, I learned that a lot of these kids come from broken homes. A lot of them live out on the streets. A lot of them were just didn't come to school because they didn't have clothes, they didn't have shoes, and they were teased and they were considered outcasts. So sometimes I think, like Zariah said, the foundation is everything. Whether the kids are being raised by their grandparents, aunts and uncles, parents have substance abuse or incarcerated, I think that sets it up for everything in life. And then what I would do is from there, give them an outlet for them to express themselves and things like that. So I think that's very important to understand each individual case by case and the reason why, and finding out why they are delinquent or truant or things like that, or just feel as though it's a lost cause.
Because Austin only got to ask one of his questions, I did want to make sure all our panelists could maybe answer him. So Ms. Celeste, is there anything you want to add?
Just real quick, I mean, I want to acknowledge that delinquency rates are way down. In fact, you know, when you look at the national data and even here locally, that our kids are actually doing much better when it comes to engagement in criminal activity. I mean, and so since this is a public forum, I think it's important for people to understand that since the mid 1990s, delinquency activity has decreased significantly. And then the other thing I want to just point out is that we talk a lot about the parents, and it's true, but we have to look at the systemic disinvestment in our communities and what that does to make it hard on families to raise their kids with, you know, economic support, with, you know, childcare support, with schools that have resources. And so, you know, these aren't just individual challenges. These are, as the chief pointed out, it is beyond the police force. It is a community-wide sort of investment that's needed. And so I look to our schools that there's things that they can do, and they're doing. By the way, we had CMSD involved in our development of the policy, and they're doing some great things around social emotional work, restorative justice, conflict resolution, but more could be done there.
Thank you. And thank you, Austin, for your question. We have our second student with a question for the panel, Taiwo Kolawale. Taiwo, will you please ask the panelists your first question?
Okay, thank you so much, the panelists. So my question is, based on research, it was discovered that police officers may hold unconscious biases against minority youths and make assumptions about them based on their age, their race, their dress style, appearance, and other parameters. And I think even Zara, I think, I'm not sure I got the name correctly, mentioned that sometimes the Black folks look older than their age. So my question is, how do we particularly reconcile this unhealthy sentiment while ensuring a saner, a safer, and happy society?
Thank you so much, Taiwo, for your question. I know we did touch upon this, but Chief Williams, will you start?
Sure. Our officers are trained in implicit bias. We have bias-free training that hopefully identifies those biases so that officers can respond appropriately and basically weed out those biases in the performance of their duties. We usually, not usually, but the training involves scenarios. I think Officer Tisdale talked about scenario training earlier as it relates to CIT. A lot of our training right now is scenario-based, where officers can actually role play and act out the things that they are going to see out there on the streets every day, not just our academy classes, but our in-service training. So that bias-free training puts those scenarios in a setting where we can actually act them out and afterwards talk through what should or should not have happened during those scenarios. And during a scenario, you know, we all have biases. So we have the training, we go through the scenarios, and even after the training, you may say or do something or have a mannerism that is perceived by another group, another race, another person as being biased, and you're not really aware of that. So that training kind of gives you that extra, am I doing certain things that I should not be doing in this encounter that are going to be perceived as bias or that are blatantly biased. So we do that training. Our officers have had it for the last couple of years. We definitely plan to expand upon that and have different trainers come in from different disciplines to further expand how our officers can identify and properly deal with their biases, because you can't weed them out totally. We all have them. It's just recognizing that bias and making sure that it doesn't impact your performance as a police officer.
Thank you, Chief Sarai. Did you want to add anything to a healthy way to reconcile this?
No, just because I don't even know myself how I would do it. So
we're all working together on it, right? I appreciate that. Thank you, Taiwo, for your question. We will be coming back to you for your second question, but we have a third student with us, Andrew Sobey. He also has 2 questions. Andrew, would you like to ask your first question?
Thank you guys so much for having me on. My question is my first question is very straightforward. So we all remember what happened last summer with after the shootings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Jacob Blake, and the advocacy the whole nation showed in the wake of their killings, and the way people came out to the streets and protesting. Do you believe the Cleveland consent decree has prepared police officers to carry out their tasks safely and effectively in such a unique time?
Chief Williams, we'll go back to you.
The short answer is yes. I mean, if you look at our current, can you guys hear me? I'm sorry. If you look at our current use of force stats, and I've said this on a lot of occasions, if you compare, let's say 2010 to 2015, and then 2016 to 2020, there's almost an 80% drop in fatal uses of force and use of force in general by Cleveland police officers. That period, 2016 to 2020, is kind of the meat and potatoes of the consent decree process. So I think the consent decree definitely is working. Is there a lot more work to do? Of course there is. I mean, we didn't get to the point we are as an agency with the federal government coming in and us kind of negotiating this consent decree process. We didn't get there in 4 or 5 years. So it's going to take, a little longer than 4 or 5 to get to the point where we should be. But in those brief 4 or 5 years, we've shown tremendous strides in reductions in complaints. Complaints are down. A high in 2014 of about 600 complaints against officers a year to last year, 220 complaints. So you look at those timeframes I stated, 2010 to 2015, and then 16 to 20, and it's like night and day if you really look at the actual numbers. Now, perception is another thing, and we're battling against that perception that, things that happened, and you mentioned last summer, things that happen in other parts of the country definitely affect the city of Cleveland. And people may, because something terrible happened in another state or city, may have that perception that that same thing is happening in here. But I ask people, look at the actual statistics, look at the actual things that are happening here day in and day out, and you will see a difference from, again, prior to 2015.
Officer Tisdale, do you also want to comment on the impact of the national events on policing?
Yes, definitely. I also think just as a police officer, not as a supervisor, but just to piggyback off what Chief Williams said, I think it's very important as a police that we police ourselves. I know he mentioned just several different cases that went on last year that forever changed the country, but I also think some of these situations can be avoided if officers police themselves. I know at times when I was in East Cleveland, if I seen or I observed an officer doing something, whether it was something that was a little bit more forced than it should have been to gain control of the situation, or even a conversation or language, it was checked right then and there. And if it warranted, they would be advised, hey, this will go further up the chain to try and correct that behavior, because you never know what it could lead to. Because I have worked with officers in the past where certain behavior went uncorrected, and then you had incidences where it was a criminal investigation and civil litigation for them or for the city. So I think that's very important that we understand as officers that we also police ourselves and not just rely on supervision or the community to do that, because that's where it all starts with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for your first question. Taiwo, I'd like to come back to you. You have another question for our panelists.
Yes. So thank you. How do Cleveland police officers feel about what has been happening, for example, last year, and then the overall police brutality? And what steps are you taking to make sure that these things do not happen in the city of Cleveland?
Chief Williams?
Yeah, Taiwan, I think I understand your question is, how do we feel about the events that happened last year? It was terrible. Both on the police side and the things that kind of precipitated for us May 30th and the events before and after May 30th. But also, on the community side and the anger and frustration, I understand. But we tore up our own cities. But I get it. Trust me, I get it. But it was a tough time, I think, for everybody, both on the law enforcement side, because we don't want to see our folks do bad, because it does affect us. Officer Tisdale stated, if a bad officer continues to do things bad, eventually it's going to affect us all. So I tell my officers, and I've worked my 35 years as a Cleveland police officer and the last 7.5, almost 8 as chief, to make sure that bad officers don't stick around on this job, that we get rid of them, because we don't want them. It causes issues within our ranks, and it definitely causes a ton of issues within our communities.
And Tim, can you just follow up? Sorry, Tim, can you please follow up with your perspective as you've monitored the department?
Yeah, so the public should know that we do a semi-annual report every 6 months. We do an annual report, semi-annual report on the progress of the compliance with the consent decree. You could go on our website, and every single semi-annual report is on the website. And in our 9th semi-annual report earlier this year, I think maybe that was February. We outlined all of the situations, all of the events that took place, the protests that took place last year, and gave recommendations on what the Division of Police could do better. So the other thing I want to point out in regards to the consent decree, because the question was regarding the consent decree and whether it appropriately addressed all of those things, I would say that do know that the city of Cleveland consent decree was one of the most comprehensive consent decrees that was ever put together. I mean, all of the things that it covered, from citizen complaints, bias-free policing, crisis intervention, use of force. It covers many areas. It also covers community problem-oriented policing. I mean, there's a lot that is covered under the consent decree of the city of Cleveland and the DOJ. And the good thing about that is that that is just the floor, right? So we could go above and beyond that. And one highlight that we mentioned earlier is the fact that the interactions with youth policy was going above the floor, right? And we do commend the City of Cleveland Division of Police for doing that. But there's other things that can be done, but it is one of the most comprehensive consent decrees that has been conceived.
Thank you. And I want to go, thank you, Taiwo, for your second question. Andrew, I want to go back to you. Your question somewhat is related to what Tim was talking about.
So this question actually comes from a fellow student here at Tri-C. So he asks, in what ways can the policies instated by the consent decree can be proactive rather than just reactive?
Tim, did you want to add kind of to what you were saying in that context?
Yeah, so for one, the consent decree, I believe it's over 120 times it mentions, it used the word community. And of course, that word includes youth as well. And I make that point because it's important when you talk about being proactive, that the public is proactive in participating and being involved. There are ways and there are entities and there are structures that are available for people to be involved. So I encourage individuals to participate and get involved in their district policing committees. Every one of the 5 districts has a district policing committee. You also can be involved with the Cleveland Police Commission. Strongly encourage everyone to be involved in the Cleveland Police Commission. They have various subcommittees with everyday people who are passionate about the particular issues, and they help guide policy. They make recommendations on what additional things should be done, right? In addition to what is covered within the consent decree, but also the how, right? We know the what within the consent decree, but they help shape the how. So encourage people to get involved in the structures that exist for citizen participation.
Thank you so much. Chief Williams, if you want to wrap up this question, and then we'll get to some public questions.
Yeah, just a quick last comment on that, Alex. The consent decree process itself was a reaction to things that have happened in Cleveland in the past. But the policy development, the training is totally proactive. It's not a reaction to anything. It's proactive. It's cutting edge. It's best practices. For example, our use of force policy. We barred neck holes a long time ago in our use of force policy that was developed in collaboration with our community, actually in 2018. Our use of force policy adds to the constitutional standard of objectively reasonable. It adds proportional and necessary to that policy in order for us to actually use force. The constitutional standard is only provides for an officer to be objectively reasonable, what a reasonable officer would do. We add that it has to be proportional to the force that's used against you, and it has to be necessary for law enforcement purpose on top of that constitutional standard. So it is a proactive afterwards. Once we develop policy, once we talk to our community about what needs to be done, and once we look at best practices, it's definitely a proactive document.
Thank you. And now we'd like to take some questions from the public. They've been texting them in. Alicia Ellis is going to ask those questions for us.
Awesome, thank you. I know that Gabriella had mentioned about some programming that was offered for the youth. Can other panelists speak about how work is being done with the youth to teach them how to interact with the police?
Gabriella, do you want to start with that? Or I'm sorry, Gabriella had said that. Zerai, do you want to say that? Answer that?
Can you ask the question one more time?
Yes, the question is, can you talk about what and if any work is being done with you to teach them how to interact with the police?
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. Why don't we go ahead to Chief Williams really quick on that? Is there any work that you all are doing?
Yeah, a couple of things, Alex. In development of this policy and long before this, we actually engaged with State Farm Insurance and a couple other companies in what's called a juvenile jeopardy game. It's basically almost a new version of what to do when stopped by the police. It gives our youth an education on both laws and procedures, but it also questions them on some of the perceptions they have about those laws and procedures. So it's kind of a scenario-based game where there's a question asked about, if this situation happens, then what can that police officer do? And in that juvenile jeopardy game, we actually switch roles sometimes. We have kids that play the police officer part and the officer that plays the part of the youth. So that's just one thing that we've done over the years. And we actually did that through our National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives organization, which is a Black organization throughout the country that developed that program, developed the trainer, and we pushed that program out throughout the nation. Also, right now, we're doing a 3-team alliance, the 3 Cs with our Cleveland Cavaliers, our Indians, and our Browns, where we've kind of got onto, I think this is our 10th session also, where we bring in upwards of anywhere from 45 to 70 youth, and we talk and have conversations just like we're having now and get input from them on what they would like to see in criminal justice here in Northeast Ohio. And our Cavs, Browns, and Indians have been instrumental in putting that program on. We partnered with them along with our Noble organization, and I think it's paying a lot of dividends. A lot of bright kids out there with a lot of great ideas, and we're actually trying to implement some of those ideas that come out of those conversations.
Thank you, Chief. Alicia, do we have another question?
Yes. Can you file a complaint with the department if they feel like they have an encounterment with the officer that was inappropriate?
Chief, I guess we're back to you.
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, I encourage people to file complaints against officers when they don't feel they're treated fairly and properly. Again, all I require from my officers is professional and respectful service. If you don't feel you're getting that professional, respectful service, I encourage you to file a complaint with the Office of Professional Standards. That's a civilian agency that investigates complaints against police officers by our community. If you feel the complaint rises to a different level, some criminality may be involved, you can file a complaint with our Internal Affairs Unit within the division. They investigate those criminal and serious matters against officers where there's a prosecutorial review of that case to see if there's any criminality. So I encourage folks to file complaints. If you don't feel you're treated fairly, that's the only way we get bad officers out of our division. You need to file those complaints.
Thank you. Any other questions from the public?
Yes, one more here. What things specifically are being done to have officers engaging and becoming more relatable to the community?
Gabriella, do you want to take this one?
Well, I'm sure the chief will have more to add to this, but I will go back to the value of having the reverse ride-along where officers spend time in the community, especially with young people, and hear from them directly about the challenges they're facing, the lives they're living, what they want officers to know about them and their families. And I think it also gives a chance for the young people to hear from the officers what brought them to the force. Why did they want to become a police officer? What is it they're hoping to get out of that exchange and interaction? I think what we are missing significantly here is real empathy for I will say our young people. I'm sure officers feel like people can't stand in their shoes, but because we're here talking, kids don't get, they're not employed. They don't do this voluntarily. They have these interactions with police that happen in their lives. I think what we have to be really focused on is how to build empathy for our young people and what they're facing.
Thank you so much. Alicia, was that the last question we wanted to ask this evening, or did you have another?
Yes. That's it, Alex. Thank you.
So, Chief, did you want to say anything more on that, or are you good?
Yeah, am I muted? Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
I don't know, Alex, where do I start? Coffee with a cop, pizza with a cop, shopping with a cop during Christmas time, during birthdays, ride-alongs. Gabriella brought up the reverse ride-along program. That's a great program that's instituted with our training section with our new cadets before they go on the streets. It gives them an idea of what communities across the city are like. I don't know. I can go on and on and on about what our officers are doing. Our community engagement officers that are in every district of the city. Our community relations unit that goes out everywhere. They assist with the food drives, with our food bank people and giveaways. It's the list is endless, and I wish I had prepared a list, but I didn't think we were going to go there. But our officers do a ton of things day in and day out. A lot of things that we don't pat ourselves on the back for. We just do because we're part of this community, just like everybody else. Although people don't think so, but most of our officers live in the city, and just because we work here, we are a part of the Cleveland community.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for such a robust and interesting discussion on youth and policing and giving their expertise on the topic. I'm going to hand it over to Ms. Helen Forbes Fields, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of United Way of Greater Cleveland. Thank you all for participating, and thank you to the public for those wonderful questions.
Thank you, Alex, for moderating this evening's discussion, and thank you again to the panelists for lending your expertise and your perspective. Clearly, this topic has hit a nerve and it has stimulated much thought and many questions. And United Way will post responses to public questions that we were not able to respond to this evening. We will post that on our website, and you can look for that in the next few days. And I want to also say that we are extremely proud to showcase our community's best from the Tri-C Community Campus. Thank you to all of our students for joining us this evening as well. And thanks to our sponsors, Cuyahoga Community College and Rockwell Automation, as well as our many community partners for their support in bringing this important conversation to life. We also want to thank our media partners, Cleveland City Club, WOVU 95.9 FM, WOIO, WKYC, and Fox Channel 8, as well as WCPN, which will air a replay of this community conversation next week on the Sound of Ideas. Our next panel will be held on November 10th with Daryl Snipes as our moderator from the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, and she will moderate a discussion on community engagement, recruitment, and diversity. Please join us next month, and it will be our 11th and our final series in our community conversation on the consent decree. We are proud of this engagement and the dialogue that we've seen throughout the series, and hope that it has advanced understanding of the Cleveland consent decree and police reform, and of one another. You can register through United Way's website at unitedwaycleveland.org, and registration is certainly complimentary and open to all. Thank you for being with us tonight, and please, everyone, have a great evening. Good night.